Good evening. If you're expecting an abrasive, brutal interview, I have to disabuse you right away. Frank is one of my closest friends and one of the very best people, human beings, and journalists I know who welcomed me with open arms to the New York Times 7 years ago when not everyone else did. And I admire him as I do few other people in our trade for the beauty of his prose and the consistent intelligence and moderation, I would say, but in the best sense of his thinking. And he has written an absolutely fantastic book. I really commend it to you. I think you're going to be signing copies after we're done here on stage. A fantastic book and a very important and of the moment book, the Age of Grievance, because I think we all sense that there is something qualitatively different, Frank, about the politics that or the political world that we inhabit as spectators and in some ways participants, and the one that we knew when we were coming into our profession in the 1980s, 1990s. It's not simply a matter of politics, it's everything. Everything feels that much more raw. People feel that much angrier, personally insulted, and ready to take offense at nearly anything. I think this is a sense that all of us have, and what this book does so well is explain that. So I just want to begin in this way, Frank. People have had grievances from the dawn of time. Some of those grievances are justified. Part of American life is about grievance, and many of them justify grievances. Something changed. So give us a sense of what happened that makes this the Age of Grievance.
Thank you for the question. But first of all, I want to really thank you for being here, and I want to return the compliment. I am so delighted to be your friend, to have you in my life. I'm delighted to have you at the New York Times. Whenever I'm kind of asked at a dinner party, sotto voce, like off the record, which of your fellow columnists do you like to spend time with, and do you make sure never to miss one of their columns? You are always one of the few names on that list, and you're at the very top. So thank you for being here, for doing this, and thank you all for coming. I think a lot of different things make this the Age of Grievance, but I think so much has changed in American life over recent decades that have taken the old rivalries and turbocharged them, upsized them, that have taken our tendency to kind of bicker and give into our anger and amplified and intensified that. And the book is an attempt to kind of go through those things and understand it, because I think if we're ever going to turn the page and get to a better place, which we really must do, because I think we're ruining ourselves, we're ruining our civic culture, we don't really even have a civic culture anymore, we have to understand what it is. And I think social media is a big part of it. I think we have not grappled with, recognized, talked as much as we need to about this country's turn from a fundamental optimism to a fundamental pessimism, which when you look at it squarely really kind of blows my mind. I cite a statistic in the book that I think really captures this. Since the 1970s, the Gallup organization, which you'll recognize that name as has been kind of a historical gold standard in polling, several times a year they have asked Americans since the 1970s, are you generally satisfied with the direction of life in this country, with life in this country? I forget the exact wording, it's in the book. And up until 2004, the answer they would get, sometimes more than 50% of Americans would say yes, sometimes less. Sometimes more than 60% of Americans would say yes, sometimes less. But it went like this consistently, with 50 being here, and it went above as often as it went below. Since 2004, they continue to ask this question several times a year. They've never had responses that hit 50%. So for 20 straight years, they cannot get a majority of Americans to say they're generally satisfied with life in this country. And more often than not, the percentage is under 40%. It frequently dips below 30%. Shortly after January 6, 2000, 2021, it dipped to 11%. That sort of sustained lack of optimism, lack of faith, in where the country's going, I think has devastated us. If you don't believe that tomorrow might be brighter than today, if you don't believe in the possibility of continued growth, et cetera, then you are inclined to see somebody else's gain as your loss. Your relationship with your neighbor, with your fellow American, is as likely to be competitive as it is to be collaborative. And I think that's a big, big part of what's tearing us apart.
I mean, look, Donald Trump became president in 2016 as a candidate of grievances. And I think one of the fundamental dividing lines in American politics today is many Americans think those grievances are justified. Others think, well, yeah, there's something to it, but it's wildly overblown. And it's when you parse the data, you can sort of find evidence for both points of view. But is it fair for Americans to have the nature and the intensity of the grievances that we have now, or is this kind of contrived? Is this sort of a figment of our fevered imaginations?
Well, it depends on the grievance, but take, for example, the belief in certain quarters of the right, and it's actually a widespread belief, that there were various ways in which the 2020 election was rigged and stolen, et cetera.
Wait, it wasn't?
I hate to break it to you. Well, but I mean, seriously, that is like, that could be the end of a polite conversation in a certain sort of mixed group. George Packer just wrote a fascinating piece in The Atlantic using Arizona as a sort of emblem of America today. And there was a point deep in the piece that I also make in my book, which is he was talking about how little success Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA has had in winning any of the battles it has fought, any of the core challenges.
Charlie Kirk is this young Turk conservative, I doubt he's 30 years old, who kind of rose to prominence in the last 6 or 7 years, trying to mobilize MAGA voters and move them to the right.
Yeah, and he's deeply invested in this whole threat to manhood movement that Josh Hawley wrote a book about. We have Tucker Carlson with his recommendations of testicle tanning to up your testosterone.
Really?
Bret, where have you been living? You've not been tanning your testicles?
In the place where testicles aren't tanned on a regular basis.
Wow, man. I thought you were seeming a little unmanly, but we'll talk about that more later.
Well, I live north of the city, so
But he was making the point in this piece, and I actually make this point in the book. There are all of these grievance entrepreneurs now, merchants of grievance, right? Who they actually don't want their complaint solved, because what keeps them in business is the waging of that complaint, right? They are exploiting and tilling anger for profit. But the people who they're whipping into these frenzies don't realize that. And it's extraordinarily cynical and it's extraordinarily corrosive. But to go back to, and I make this point in the book too, we are a nation founded on grievance, right? Grievance has been the engine of some of our
actually, if you look at the grievances that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had, it was a de minimis tax and a whole list of particulars that historians will tell you were largely fraudulent claims, but we had a revolution anyway.
But even the word grievance, if you go look at the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment, in a very kind of positive sense, it's saying like citizens deserve a redress to their grievances. When you see the word grievance in a news story these days, 9 times out of 10, the connotation is negative. It basically means like another one of those ill-considered, reflexively offered, like way amplified beyond any merit complaint. And that's because the grievances are so many and they're flying around in all directions and they completely mingle urgent causes with ridiculous nothingness, right?
There are a number of other factors that I think, and you address them in the book, that typify and maybe help explain the age of grievance. One is rising expectations. I mean, we now have grievances about things that would have dumbfounded our grandparents, that we would be bothered by because so much of life has become healthier, wealthier, more convenient, more kind of amazing. So it's grievance is really not just a function of how you see your lot in life, but what you think you deserve. And I'd like you to talk about that. There's another aspect, which is that we're also in the age of identity, where one sense of oneself is very connected to an identity or a perceived identity, and people like taking offense. I mean, this is, I think, a feeling most of us have wherever we sit politically, that identity politics and grievance politics go together. Those are two separate things, but I want you to unpack them for us.
I want to react to what you said about expectations, because that's super important. And you know this as well as I do, because you read as widely as I do. But whenever you look at those studies of like which countries are happiest and which aren't, or which people are happiest and which aren't, it's never about who has their material needs most readily taken care of. It's never about who's most affluent. It's all about whether your life lives up to what you expected. How big is the shortfall of what you expected and what you have? And the glory, in this country, some of the things that make this country so special are also things that make it so difficult. This is a country that promises big. It says to people, you can be whoever you want to be. You can dream as big and reach as high, and you can get there, because this is America. And that's great to some degree. You know, it is what makes people ambitious in ways that lead to invention, that lead to all sorts of progress. But when you make that promise and then somebody looks at his, her, or their life, and it is way short of their expectations or of the expectations that have been held before them, they feel embittered, they feel frustrated. And so I think America is a particularly intense laboratory of grievances, because when you tell people to dream as big as we do, and again, that's very special and important, you are setting up people to be disappointed in the reality versus that dream.
Well, because the ambition in many countries is a concept of satisfaction, of sufficiency, and the ambition in America, if you summed it up in a word, is often more.
Bigger is better.
It reminds me of one of the great anecdotes in my life. I'll tell it very briefly. 10 years ago, I wrote a book, and I was invited to give a presentation of the book to a board led by a billionaire. This guy, when I was flying down to this event to talk to the board, I looked him up on Forbes. I think he was worth like $6 or $7 billion at the time. I mean, to me, just an unimaginable sum. Anyway, I get there, and I'm seated next to him, and he's talking about, now he's late and departed, so I can mention, he's complaining about Sheldon Adelson. And what a terrible philanthropist Sheldon is, and how he nickels and dimes his charities and one thing or another. And then this guy, as I said, worth about $6 or $7 billion, looks at me and says, you know, Bret, I don't have Sheldon's kind of money. That was his grievance.
I was going to say.
We talked about expectations. You spend a lot of time also talking about identity politics, which is something that's unfurling across the country, college campuses, everywhere. What is the relationship between identity politics and grievance culture?
Well, I think what we've done with identity politics, it's like so much else. We've taken steps that we needed to take in a good direction, and then we've taken more steps and gone way too far. Identity politics exist because there was merit, and there was even at times urgency in recognizing that different Americans had different experiences, you know, some terrible, and had different access to opportunity, often based on matters of identity. That's an important thing, that was and remains a really important thing to recognize. But we've somehow sent the message, and the media is, I think, very culpable in this. We've somehow sent the message that identity is destiny. And that's a really dangerous message, because it takes character and accountability out of the equation. And we've invited and sometimes encouraged people to see their life experience solely in terms of identity. There's a point I make in the book about how that leads to sort of grievances that take concerns that are legitimate and then weaponize them, deploy them in ridiculous ways. And it's just a small example, but it's a tidy and I think illuminating one. When Brittany Griner was horrifically imprisoned in Russia.
She is the women's basketball star.
I think that's one we don't need. I think people, yeah, come on. Brittany Griner?
No, this is you probably don't know. Women's WNBA star.
But the point is, everybody does know that name, and yet I saw not just in the kind of feverish precincts of Twitter, still called Twitter then, I think maybe it was X, but not just on social media, but even in conventional media, I saw progressive commentators complaining that she was languishing in a Russian prison because nobody cared about her because she was black, because she was a woman, and because she was a lesbian. Now, racism remains a reality and a problem, no debate. Same with sexism, same with homophobia. Brittany Griner was getting a degree of attention from the Biden administration and from the media that dwarfed the attention paid to any other political prisoner I can think of in the last decade. And many of us only learned the name of Paul Whelan, who remains imprisoned in Russia, because he was mentioned in an auxiliary fashion to stories about Brittany Griner. When you claim, when as a matter of identity politics, as a matter of kind of grievance merchandising, grievance entrepreneurship or whatever, when you claim and see sexism, homophobia, racism where it doesn't exist, you completely hurt those causes because you invite people who don't want to listen to you about those problems, you invite them to tune you out. You erode your own credibility. And this happens time and again. Hand in glove with identity politics is this habit people have of taking one lens through which to evaluate, through which to see the world and evaluate everything that happens. And reality, life, politics, everything is usually much more complicated than that. And when you only use one lens, and when you can't see anything on its own merits, it becomes impossible for people using different lenses to speak with one another, to collaborate, to compromise, to find common ground.
Yeah, you write about this in connection to this very point. You say this was a story in the New Yorker where a Latino murdered people, I think in an El Paso Walmart or something.
I think that was the one, yeah.
And the story then twisted itself into contortions to talk about the rise of Latino white supremacy. You write, I understood what the author was saying. I also understood how cynical and selective that willed logic was, and I understood the agenda behind it, to preserve the progressive, race-obsessed taxonomy of oppressors and oppressed, evildoers and those to whom evil is done, by finding a way to apply it even to events that resist or contradict it. And that's absolutely the case, that these stories, and I think we in the media are to some extent responsible for it, we try to attach a narrative to stories which are actually much more complicated and should be more interesting because they're more complicated.
This happened, and this is another example I think I cite in the book. This happened in relation to, in Atlanta, remember I'm going to use a shorthand that's probably inaccurate, and I apologize, the massage parlor murders or whatever. In the beginning, because many of the victims were Asian American, immediately it got written about across many, many media outlets as an Asian American, anti-Asian American hate crime. And there were sidebars about the rise in Asian American hate crimes, especially in the aftermath of Trump's crazy, loopy comments about COVID and saying hideous things like Kung flu and that sort of thing, right? When some more reporting started to be done, it turned out these were parlors this person had been to. I think I may be getting the details wrong here on the stage, but I have them in the book. But it turned out it looked like this was someone who had really, really kind of unhealthy relationships with his own sexuality. He was striking, and he was attacking people who were the objects of urges that he was struggling with and didn't want to have and felt ashamed about. It did not seem, once some reporting was actually done, it did not seem on this occasion to be about race, even though by dint of working in these places, a majority of the victims were Asian American. But the media immediately went to the Asian American hate crime angle. Another great example of this kind of rush to judgment that is a rush to apply isms and to apply kind of political caricatures to situations, the situation on the mall with the Covington High School kids. That turned out to be, the media ended up having to twist itself into backflips and stuff to kind of backtrack on that story, because right out of the gate, everyone had said, oh my God, this is an example of white supremacy in high school form. You know, these are just MAGA youngsters, this is whatever. They're taunting this Native American elder. It turned out to be way more complicated. It turned out that they were not the instigators, that there was a third group on the mall that was doing it. But we just rush out with these predetermined judgments, with these isms, and these are isms that kind of validate and perpetuate and intensify identity politics.
So we talked about expectations and identity. There's another word that you used in the book that I think is very apt: infantilization. And I think some of us looking at what's happening on college campuses, particularly in the last 8 or 9 months, feel this, but this is a process that's been going on for some time. And one of the stories you tell is of what happened to Nicholas Christakis, a professor at Yale, and his wife, Erica.
Yeah.
Give us that story again and the lesson that you draw from it.
Well, what I mentioned in the book, this one some of you probably immediately recognize this, but I'll refresh everybody's memory. This was Nicholas Christakis was and remains a professor. And in fact, Yale, to its credit, has given him like awards and such in the aftermath of this. Yeah. They've not shrunken from him, but Erica Christakis no longer teaches there. They were, I think, then they were called, and I think the word has now been retired. And in this case, I think it's a great cleaning up the language. They were residential masters of a college at Yale, which meant they lived there. It's almost sort of like a proctor thing. In addition to being, he was a distinguished professor. She, I think, was a lecturer. And Halloween was coming around, and the university, like a lot of universities at that time, was putting out an edict about, okay, as you put together your costumes, make sure you don't do anything culturally insensitive, don't do anything in the realm of cultural appropriation, et cetera. And Erica Christakis sent around an email saying, you know, I think we can trust students to police themselves. I think we can trust students, like they're not so fragile that if they see, you know, something, whatever, et cetera. And it was a very kind of measured in its tone, but it was basically saying, do we really need these edicts? Aren't we all grown-ups? Can't we kind of police ourselves, and can't we kind of deal with sometimes the messiness of life? And a group of students just freaked out about this. And this video went viral, some of you probably saw it, in which Nicholas Christakis, to his credit, went out into a courtyard, to talk to students and say, okay, tell me why you're so upset. And he was just screamed at. And there's this one young woman on tape who's basically kind of telling him that he's a monster, she's using the F word. And what she says in this is, don't you understand?
This is an undergraduate student screaming at a full professor.
Correct.
Yes.
And what she's saying to him is, don't you understand this is our home, and you have like essentially spoiled our home. You've made us feel unsafe in our home, right? Well, first of all, like this says a lot about the whole new notion of college, right? When I was in college, I didn't expect a degree of kind of safety or home comfort, emotional or otherwise. That wasn't my understanding of the transaction or what was going on. But this was kind of connected to this notion that students today, you know, K through 12 and in college, should be protected from offense, you know, should never be feeling unsettled and disoriented. Now, I don't want any student subjected to hate speech. I don't want any student kind of dealt with disrespectfully or demeaningly. But I actually kind of want students unsettled and disoriented some of the times, because I think that's called education, right? Yanking people outside their comfort zones, asking them to see a world that is messier, and messier sometimes means more threatening than they realize, encouraging them to make sense of that. I mean, that's an important part of building resilience and of growing up. And here's the thing, most students can take it. We have, I think, in the audience tonight, a student who was in a first-year seminar that I taught during the last academic year at Duke. And if she were on this—
If you have a grievance, now's the time to express it.
Yes, yeah,
there are note cards, and I'll read your question.
I'm not going to say her last name, but Juliet, if you were here, it was a delight to have you in class, and I think she would back me up on this. We had some really complicated, messy discussions in that seminar right after October 7th. And not a single student in that class, and there were Jewish students in that class, there were students who didn't understand much about Judaism or et cetera, not a single student in that class complained, not a single student in that class left the room. We had a candid, robust, nuanced discussion. Most students not only can handle that, but I think want that. But there is this temptation, this fear about that one student who's going to scream in the quad, scream in the courtyard, and as a result, there are sometimes habits, policies in higher ed that are infantilizing.
Are you a little afraid of your students?
No.
I mean, you're the student here accepted, but...
I maybe was in the beginning, but I have to tell you, I don't distrust any of the reporting that's been done. Mm-hmm. And you should talk a little bit about your own visit to Duke. I brought you into a class at Duke, and thank you for coming. But after 3 years at Duke, I have introduced my students to speakers with whom they would disagree, including you. But I mean, I went beyond you. I had Kevin Williamson, mm-hmm. who's a conservative writer who's gotten a lot of trouble for things he said about his beliefs about abortion. He's gotten in a lot of trouble for that. I mean, trouble on social media. He lost a job. The Atlantic hired him and then unhired him in the span of like 2 weeks. And the Atlantic prides itself on being heterodox, right? I had him. He's a brilliant writer. And I had him zoom into an opinion writing class that I was teaching, and I said to the students, your responsibility, your job with Kevin, as with any speaker, is to read up on him and to know his biography and to come to class with intelligent questions, and you are immediately going to trip across some stuff that you're really going to just disagree with. Here's the thing, bring that into class, ask him about it, you know. Not a single student went to a dean, not a single student tried to cancel me, not a single student complained about it. I think that today's students are well, it's much more complicated than the media portrayals. I think maybe I'm lucky to be at Duke because it has a slightly less politically heated culture than some Northeastern universities. But if I was ever scared of my students, I'm not after 3 years. So
the characterization of today's Gen Z students as quote unquote snowflakes is exaggerated, unfair?
It's a broad brush generalization that kind of is rooted and finds validation in plenty of anecdotes and examples out there, but I do not think it's the norm, no.
Let's talk about what's on many people's minds, which are the encampments and protests that have seized at least a number of campuses. I mean, to a certain extent, Duke, we saw it with Jerry Seinfeld's commencement speech.
But like 12 students stood up and walked out.
A smaller thing, much more serious up in Morningside Heights.
Oh, yeah.
At Yale. What is your diagnosis of what's going on there? Is it the media lens focusing on a small number of students, or is it a kind of an expression or the symptom of the disease that you're diagnosing here?
It is the media lens. So, and there was kind of a second wave of journalism about this. And in fact, sorry, that just got really loud. Wow. And in fact, as fate has it, when I did Bill Maher's show a couple weeks ago, in his closing monologue, he actually took the media to task for something that was correct, and he kind of said, there had been some polling of college students about what are you most concerned about, and there was stuff ranked, and Gaza and Palestinians and Israel and the whole situation. Yeah, it was like below the top 10, right? Yeah. You wouldn't know that from media coverage. Does that mean that the coverage was irresponsible and shouldn't have happened? Maybe it was irresponsible in magnitude, but I think there's a real story there, and one of the stories there, and this goes back to identity politics, is of all of the terrible things happening in the world, of all of the people who, like the people of Gaza, have been in a situation where there have been, thousands of deaths and aggression and all that. And again, I'm not doing a victims thing here, and I've been gobsmacked by how quickly what happened on October 7th left the public conversation and ceased to be a bit of context in the wider discussion. That was really, really weird, and I know you have your theories on why, and I'd love to hear them in just a nanosecond. But I do think part of the reason this became the campus issue is because it grafted onto this oversimplified, reductive, overgeneralized notion of the world that that the powerful are always wrong and the less powerful are always right. The lighter-skinned people are always wrong and the darker-skinned people are always wrong. And that doesn't even work as well in this situation. Yeah. But there is this paradigm that too many students have been taught and have bought into, that affluent is bad, poor is virtuous. Again, powerful, whatever. And I think the Israel versus Palestinians in Gaza it got subsumed in that paradigm, and so it became about something much larger than the facts of what was going on there, which is one of the reasons why the brutality, the slaughter of October 7th exited the equation, because it didn't fit the tidy narrative.
I noticed this.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, so far
Okay,
so good.
All right. It's been a long month already.
Well, no, but I noticed this. I now have 2 kids in college, and so I took a look at what the questions are, and it's amazing to me the extent to which elite colleges are essentially sorting for students who have stories of being hard done by. And that's valid, but for many students, what are you going to say? I'm an upper middle class child of a happy family, and I was in the school play. And my grades are great, right?
I can tell you what they say.
Well, no, but just let me finish this. So what the poor students who don't have a tale of woe have to do is sort of glom onto one. And so because the story is the person we are looking for, an ideal, let's say, Columbia student is the ideal victim. If you can't be that person, be that person's ally, right? And so a lot of these students are feeling the need to show their virtue or signal their virtue by being the best allies of a cause which they think perfectly captures the victim-victimizer binary. Never mind what reality is all about. That we've so valorized the concept of being a victim or an ally of a victim that helps explain the culture that we're seeing, at least in some of these schools. They never ask, like, tell us about a time you changed your mind, right? Or questions that get more to the point of your character or your interests or your aspirations, rather than what happened to you, where you come from, and these things. And I think that helps account for why we're seeing this at, say, Columbia. I keep picking on Columbia, but we're not seeing it at Purdue, for example.
And there's been some great stuff written about how this was less prevalent at public universities whose student bodies were less affluent.
Or at community colleges, because they don't have the luxury of worrying about a conflict 7,000 miles away.
But I want to, just because it triggered, I shouldn't use the word triggered, it prompted.
Triggered is a triggering word. There's a glossary of terms. We are not, you have a whole section on these glossaries.
Oh, I know. Like, I'm supposed to be, according to the hurtful language glossaries, every time someone, because I have no sight in my right eye and live with the risk of blindness, which was the subject of my last book, I'm supposed to be triggered and aggrieved every time I hear or read the phrase blind study or blind faith.
Well, I would say, I would.
And here's the thing, I will continue through my life to use the phrases blind study and blind faith, because I know a metaphor when I see one, and that's more, I'm more interested in that than in being.
I would say it's very brave of you to talk about this, but that's another.
You can't use brave either.
Triggering word. Well, exactly. So I'm going to just walk off the stage now.
No, and I realize I'm sounding, and this is silly. I realize I'm sounding like some sort of anti-woke conservative, which I'm not. But it's really important that people, whether you want to characterize them as liberals or left of center or whatever, it's really important that we talk about the ways about this sort of ridiculous stuff, because it has driven people, into political camps where you don't necessarily want them to be, and it has made them feel like you are exotic and you are some sort of threat because of all this essentially gibberish. But I want to go back to the college admissions thing, because funnily enough, in a book I wrote a couple years ago called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, which is about the college admissions mania.
Another good book.
I addressed the fact that what do you write about if you're not the product of hardship? And in fact, from college admissions counselors, private ones, I got great stories. Like, students were so intent on portraying themselves as the fruits of great hardship, that like one of the students a counselor was working with had written an essay about how she was trying to show her fortitude or something, and it was about how passionate she was about instruction and all that, that she wrote about how she so didn't want to peel away from a French instructor at one point that instead she wet herself. She thought this was like an expression of virtue. Another student wrote about how hard his parents had tried to conceive him. And the counselor had to point out, you had no role in that. You were like a bystander zygote to that story, you know? This is not like... so people find ways to, yeah.
We are going to turn to audience questions in a few minutes. You know, one of the things, I have to say, it is a pleasure to read really good prose. And here I'm going to read you quoting yourself, but it's still really good. This is a column you wrote. I think this was this is one of your last columns when you were transitioning from Times full-time columnist to Duke professor, although all of you know that you can read Frank every single week in the Times in his delightful newsletter.
Thank you.
In which some of my sentences occasionly make appearances.
More than occasionally.
I'm very
More
proud
than
of that. So you're talking about your worries, and you talk about your worries of what you and I do, punditry, and you have this wonderful line that I want to read. So we pundits are merchants of certitude in a world where much is in doubt and many questions don't have one right answer. As such, we may be encouraging arrogance and unyieldingness in our readers, viewers, and listeners. And those attributes need no encouragement in America today. I love that phrase, merchants of certitude. So what I'd like to do is ask you to reflect on how we, you and I, but how we as a culture start to think about doing better. What needs to start changing? Because I mean, we are deeply sunk, and I think your remarks illustrate that it's really a bipartisan phenomenon. It's not just one side or the other. We are deeply sunk in this culture of grievance and being absolutely sure of how we feel, the justice of our cause, the insults we have sustained, and our need to sort of keep the outrage dialed always to 11. So how do we start turning it back? What do we need to do?
Well, I think people like you and I, and dare I say it, I think political leaders, but I think we need to model. I think we need to model qualities that people don't model much anymore. I think we need to be willing to say. I think we need to be ready to say it's complicated when we're confronted with a situation that doesn't fit neatly into any binary, into any villain-victim scenario or anything like that. I think we need to kind of hold our judgment in reserve when we don't have a full set of facts, and we don't do that much. You know, I think we need to stop going in a very kind of lazy fashion to the identity politics basket when we're writing things. Like, if you look at the coverage of a modern political campaign, and I talk about this in the book, so often, like, politician A begins to become prominent and stories are assigned, right? And we start reading stories like how this politician is likely to appeal or not to Black Americans, how this politician's policies might be good or bad for LGBTQ Americans. There's this kind of slicing up of the electorate as if every single group of Americans, as defined in these particular ways, has their own discrete and the concerns, and all of them have those concerns. We're seeing that that's not the case. We're seeing it in some very interesting and, to my mind, disturbing numbers about how many Latino Americans, how many Black Americans versus 4 years ago are giving a look to Donald Trump. That tells us something. It tells us people can't be reduced to categories as quickly as we often reduce them. And we in the media, not necessarily you and I, although I'm sure we have our own sins in this regard, we need to kind of, when we're noticing that complexity, we need to ask ourselves, has that been integrated into the questions we ask about politicians, into the way we cover them? That's one of many things we need to do. We need to be humble. The last chapter of my book, which the Times nicely excerpted 1,500 words of that chapter, is all about humility and being humble. To believe that you are always right is not only wrong, it's unhumble. To believe that someone who disagrees with you doesn't deserve a stage or doesn't deserve your ear or your time is fundamentally unhumble. To go to the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and decide that because an election didn't turn out the way you thought it should, you should be breaking windows, and desecrating the US Capitol, that is fundamentally unhumble. No one of us gets a world precisely to his, her, or their liking, and no one of us should expect that. But again, we live in an age of grievance and infantilization where for some reason, with I think a critical mass of Americans, it's my way or the highway. It's I want it this way, and if I'm not getting it this way, I am wronged. I am the victim of an injustice. There are hideous, gross injustices in our world and in our country, but some of what people complain about today are not. And when you wage complaints that are indiscriminate and overwrought like that, you are doing a disservice to the solving of those injustices.
One of the perils of our profession, in part because we usually have about 800 or so words to make our point, is that our job, and 800 words seems like a luxury compared to the people who are on Twitter or other media where you have fewer words, is that the medium asks us to simplify, asks us to have 3 points and to prove them almost syllogistically and to stick by them. And when you live in a world of simplification, it's also a world of hardening, right? You've arrived at your 3 core points and you're going to defend them to the nines. I had an interesting experience, I guess, I don't know, about 8 months ago or so, where I was on stage with Gina McCarthy, who was Obama's director of the Environmental Protection Agency, and someone whose views are very different from mine on lots of issues. But what was interesting was that on stage, I noticed that if you were willing, if you're willing to speak and to complexify your thinking rather than simplify it, your thoughts would extend and suddenly start to overlap in intriguing ways with people you thought were on the opposite side of your politics or your ideology. So if in our case, we were talking about climate, and climate is one of those issues where it can very rapidly become very, very bitter, right, and set in its ways. But if you start to say, well, what are a host of climate solutions, and one of them turns out to be nuclear power, you're suddenly going to discover that a lot of conservatives who, for whatever reasons, like the idea of nuclear power, and it has a lot to recommend it in the climate debate, suddenly say, that's a point on which we can begin to agree. Yeah. And I struggle with this in my own writing, which is, how do I make space, again, knowing that the format is limited, to at least begin to acknowledge another point of view, to at least see some merit in what other people are saying, often not to weaken my point or dilute it, but to make it that much more convincing, because at least your reader can recognize that you've taken the trouble to see it in a different way and to express it as your opponent might express that idea. And I think that's also a piece of the humility that you're speaking of.
Well, you're right, and it's hard to do in 800 words, but one thing that you and I and our colleagues can try to do is you can do it over time.
Some of our colleagues.
Well, I mean, you don't have to accomplish all of that in one outing. You know, you can accomplish it over the course of a number of outings. But also, I just always like to say this when I'm among like caring, intelligent people, like the people in this audience. No, that wasn't a joke. Someone's laughing. That was earnest. You know, readers have a responsibility here too. And more than ever, you are getting the news you're asking for. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, if the New York Times or some other news organization like it wanted to know what you were reading, what you were liking best or whatever, it would have very blunt and imperfect tools for doing that. It could send out a survey to its subscribers. It could do focus groups, and companies did all that sort of stuff. Now, because 90% of you or more are consuming the paper online, all of that is tracked. And I don't mean in a nanny cam way, like, you know, each individual reader is profiled and tracked, but we know how many eyeballs, how many clicks every story is getting. We know how much time people are spending with it. One of the reasons that the Times knows what a blockbuster success Bret and Gail's weekly conversation is because it has this phenomenal number for how long, not only for how many people click on it, but for how long people stay with it. How many
all the way to the end.
The Times can tell whether you came to a story from a smartphone, whether you came to it from a Google search that you did, et cetera, whether you came to it from social media, from Facebook, from X. Like, every time I say X, I feel like, what am I saying? Yeah. I'm going to call it Twitter. But my point is, and papers need to be read and they need to have audience in order to stay in business and have the revenue for doing even those stories that nobody is clicking on. What that means is that the way you consume news influences the news you're getting from that news organization 1 week, 1 month, and 1 year later, because it is seeing what you respond to. So when in 2017 I would do an event like this with someone like you or someone else, and readers would say, why did you all write so much about Trump? I would always say, why did so many of you click so religiously on those stories? Because, no, it's a really important point, because if you've been clicking, not you in this room, but if readers had been clicking with the same frequency and dependability on John Kasich stories, within a matter of weeks, if not days, they would have seen more John Kasich stories, right? So we need, if we want columns from pundits that acknowledge gray areas and that incorporate nuance, patronize and click on those columns. If you want to see more on a politician who you think is a great source of hope and is underexposed, click on stories. In fact, log off, log back on, and click a second time. And then go to your smartphone and come at it. But I mean, the reading public needs to know that it has an unflexed power here and some responsibility, as do we.
You know, in that sense, and I'll just say this anecdotally and briefly before we go to questions, you know, if you look for my conversation with Gail on X, Twitter, it's nowhere. Because the algorithms of social media are built for outrage. They're built for controversy. And yet, both Gail and I often will remark, we marvel at how darn popular the thing is. I mean, we're just like, it's the easiest thing we do, and there it's this hit. And people tell us again and again, you like each other, there's humor, there's disagreement, but it's civil. It is, the whole conversation is a step away, is a step back, a big step back from grievances. And one of the things we occasionally do, we'll say, you got a point, Gail, right? Or well, a little less vice versa,
and
but that's my grievance.
No, and there's humility in that, yeah.
And there's humility in that, and I think there's such an appetite for it if we only began to recognize what an absence it is in our lives, to have conversations, interactions that don't feel like we're walking on eggshells, where there's some sort of a sense of good faith and even love that people with whom you disagree are just, you know, want to express themselves, want to communicate, want to feel like we're not a nation of strangers, which is a point you make in your book.
There is an appetite for it, and I think there's a political appetite for it, but one of the big problems in this country, and one of the things we need to change, and when in the book I discuss things we need to do differently, is we need to come up with changes to our primary system so that it's not just the merchants of anger and the extremists who graduate from the primaries in each party. You know, the problem is in too many instances when you get to the general election, there is no political equivalent of the Gale-Bret conversation to vote for, because that has been eliminated by the nature and the dynamics of the modern primary.
You also mention 4 governors in your book. Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan, Andy Beshear, and Phil Scott of Vermont.
Yeah, I think I also mention...
And maybe Roy Cooper, your governor in North Carolina.
I mentioned in the book, and I've written more about him since, actually the kind of politician who I take great hope from is Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania.
Who I'm busy nominating for president, not that anyone is listening to me. Tell us why those governors stand apart in your view.
So in all of their case, let's start with Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan. When they were in office, they're both out of office now. Larry Hogan's running for the Senate from Maryland.
Both Republicans in blue states.
Well, that's the thing. They were, by most measures, if you were trying to identify the 2 bluest states in the country, at least back when they were governors, you would pick Massachusetts and Maryland by various metrics. Charlie Baker, Republican, Larry Hogan, Republican, 2-term governors of those states, and both of them had approval ratings that almost consistently stayed above 60% and put them like in the top 5 governors in the nation. When I see, or we can talk about Andy Beshear, a Democrat who is prospering in Kentucky. When I see a politician of one party being elected repeatedly and enjoying great favorability ratings and great favor among his or her, their constituents, I think that's something we want to look at, right? Because that's the quintessence of finding common ground. And yet no one talks of those politicians as people who have kind of presidential possibilities, because the feeling is they would not graduate from the primary, right? They would not appeal enough to the ideologues in their parties. But obviously, once they get in office, all of those states have people on the extremes, people on the center. Once they get into office, it turns out they can bridge the divides. And all of them, if you look at the way they governed, they emphasized issues of universal concern. They emphasized the practical things government can do rather than culture wars. They did all of those things that turned down the temperature rather than turning it up. And I just think we should, whenever you see an enormously popular governor of a purple state or of a state with a majority of citizens who are not in the same party, you want to look at what that person's doing, you want to exalt it, and you want to ask the question, how can we get that in Congress and in the White House?
We're going to turn to your questions, and this is a really good one. Is there a grievance you've had that you regret having?
This is going to be a strange answer to give at a moment when I think there are legitimate reasons to worry about the rise of Christian nationalism. And I don't think that's an invented concern. But I was condescending and dismissive and just negative about deeply religious people when I was younger in a way that I'm ashamed of now. Because while we certainly are seeing some examples in real time, and we could go a whole other hour if we brought the Alitos into it, so let's not. While there are certainly examples of people who I think take their religiousness and foist it on other people and lose all sense of the separation of church and state. Many of the very religious people I've known in my life as I've gone through the years, their religion has been what has driven them to acts of kindness, to acts of compassion, to kind of vote and engage in public lives in ways that are about the improvement of people's welfare. I painted with a broad and inaccurate brush about religion when I was younger, and I regret that.
Next question. By the way, my answer is I still seethe with grievances. Just.
What's your main grievance if we're defining grievance as an overwrought complaint, Bret?
Oh, they're all about my mother.
That's not a grievance, that's a therapy point.
Next question. How has increased economic inequality played into an increased sense of grievance?
Oh, I mean, in a major way, because it's coupled with something else. If it were just, we've always had income inequality. It is more severe now than it has been at certain points past, right? But there are two other things going on that I think make it a problem bigger even than itself. One is it is income inequality coupled with diminished social mobility, right? The bigger problem is people feeling like they don't have the tools or the agency or examples around them of being able to ascend the ladder as is promised in the American myth, in the American everything. The other thing, and I think this doesn't get enough attention, is our modern service economy is such a brutal engine of envy, right? Every service you can imagine is now offered in more tiers than ever before that are exactly tailored to how much you can afford and that end up being ways in which you flaunt what you can do over other people. Even if that wasn't the goal of the service, go back 30 years, those of you who've been alive as long as you and I have been or longer, go back and think about air travel 30 years ago versus now and the experience of going to the airport, right? Now you go to the airport and at every step of the way you are told and reminded of exactly where in the pecking order you fall, right? You know, you don't have TSA pre-check and you're in like an hour-long line. You have TSA pre-check, your line's maybe 15 minutes, but you're gazing longingly at those people who've entered the paradise of clear. You know, and then they board the plane in zones that have these sort of seemingly, you know, not loaded numbers, but that are basically telling you, you know, whether you're going to have any access to the overhead bin, you know, whether you're going to be sitting like this or like this, you know, and that's just and. You summon a ride share. You summon an Uber or a Lyft. Like, you know, do you want the larger SUV, you know, or are you okay with the little one, you know, and the price accordingly? When you subscribe to a streaming service, can you afford to do the ad? Everything comes in all of these versions, and they tell you exactly where you are in the economic pecking order, and they show you, and by dint of the other options, they show you where other people are.
You know, I would add one more point. The way in which the ultra-wealthy flaunt wealth and the way in which they contribute or fail to contribute to society, I think, is an engine and a legitimate engine of grievance. Mm-hmm. And you know, you mentioned him in your book. George H.W. Bush was to the manner born, Greenwich Country Day and all the rest of it. But when he was 18, he joined the Navy, got on a plane, got shot down over an island in Chichijima in the Pacific, rescued by a submarine. There was a sense, I'm the kind of guy who knows that.
No, I was smiling because I was thinking if I were Donald Trump, I don't like people who are shot down.
Yeah, exactly.
I like people who stayed aloft, you know.
But there was a sense among the wealthy that they had additional responsibilities to society. And I think that has changed, that has magnified the sense of grievance. I remember on visits, and you've reported from war zones as well, but on visits to Afghanistan and Iraq, the guys I was talking to hadn't gone to Harvard, and they weren't aspiring for Nantucket. And that, I think, changes the sense that those who have gotten it in a way that is in some ways unearned and unshared, and that changes the equation. Okay, this is the most important question of the night.
Oh my God, it's going to be food related.
Yes. How did you know? He did not see the picture, the questions. I
have ESPN.
As the former NYT food critic, what is your favorite New York City restaurant right now?
I don't have one right now because I have not been coming back to New York that much. And when I come back to New York, it tends to be for like something that's happening in the evening that takes me out of the restaurant equation. So I don't have one. I'm sorry.
This evening's a total disappointment.
I know.
let's go to a harder question.
I can give you my favorite Chapel Hill restaurant, but what's that going to do for you, right?
All right. To what extent is right-wing grievance rooted in racism?
Some of it is, and some of it is not. I mean, this is what I mean about like we have to acknowledge the complexity of stuff. And it's interesting when people like our colleague Thomas Edsall go through in a very kind of scientific and expansive way, like can you say Donald Trump's 2016 election was the product of racism? The answer they come up with is it's much more complicated than that. Some right-wing grievance is rooted in racism. Some of it's rooted in homophobia or transphobia. And some of it actually stems, and this is what people on the left side of the line need to acknowledge, some of it stems from economic changes in the country. You referred to income inequality before, that some people have come down on the losing end of, and when they listen to politicians talk, they don't hear that reality acknowledged, and they don't hear solutions to what they're going through being proposed. If we had, I did an event here in New York last week with a crew of people that included Tim Ryan, the former Democratic congressman from Ohio, lost his Senate race to J.D. Vance, God help us. And J.D. Vance had a big piece of real estate in the Times today, but that again, that would be the third hour after we do the Alitos in hour 2 and J.D. Vance in hour 3. Yeah, don't worry, we're not going to do that. You know, I mean, he makes the point as a Democrat, and he's correct, that if you go to places in the heartland of this country where, you know, manufacturing plants have closed, where the opioid epidemic is intense, you meet people who feel completely left behind by changes in society, changes that aren't about race or ethnicity or anything like that, and who feel like politicians have not seen their pain. I mean, that was, to talk about J.D. Vance, that was part of the point of Hillbilly Elegy. That was a book that had a lot of merit, even if it became the springboard for a political career that, to my thinking, has been merit. Curious at best. Yeah.
Has a decline in institutions, especially organized religion, led to this age of grievance?
Yes, because institutions is one word for it. We no longer congregate in as many places as we once did. I mean, what was written years ago in Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, which I think is a kind of seminal book in that sense, all of these forces in modern life have taken us away from places where we congregated and thus, you know, maybe talked to and jousted ideologically, politically with people who weren't exactly like us. When we congregate, which isn't even the right verb for it anymore these days, we are sorted, not just online, but we're sorted physically into communities of the like-minded, of the like-skinned, of the like-walleted, or whatever that phrase would be. And the death of many of these institutions has taken us out of settings and out of opportunities where we were part of more diverse groups, but also part of projects bigger than ourselves, right? We need to recognize that the common good matters as much as our personal happiness, right? We need to recognize that there are collective projects that are much more important than our idiosyncratic individual aspirations. Institutions, when they were healthy, helped us do that, and the death of them, I think, pushes us in the other direction. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I agree emphatically. And by the way, our colleague David French wrote recently an extraordinary story about what happened with him in his church, which tells you something about the evolving, or I should say, declining nature of institutional and life, particularly in the religious sphere in America, and how ugly and bitter it's become. A final question, because you have some books to sign. And I love this question. So think carefully about how you answer it. For the Love of Sentences is one of my favorite features of your newsletter. Who are some of your favorites who are often nominated? Do people ever nominate you? And which you then omit from the list?
First of all, I love that people love that, but I have a mixed relationship with that. So most often when people talk to me about newsletter, they say, I especially love For the Love of Sentences. Yeah. And I want to say, so you especially love all the sentences in the newsletter that aren't mine. Okay, thank you. But no, I'm glad. People do nominate my sentences all the time, but I don't include them as a rule. And people have kind of figured that out, and now I get these sweet notes from readers saying, I'm going to nominate a sentence of yours that you're not going to use. There are people who I have to not put in the newsletters for the Love of Sentences sections as often as they're nominated because they'd be there too often. You are one of the primary people like that. And I'm not just saying that because he's on the stage, because it's like I do a second Bret filter. I'm like, okay, that's not really the best of Bret, so we're keeping him out this week because he's going to be back next week or the week after that. Someone who's been writing amazing sentences and I've had to kind of censor him out of the newsletter is, oh my gosh, and now I'm having a moment where I'm forgetting his name, but the book critic for the Washington Post. Ron Charles, yes.
Yeah.
Ron Charles is on this streak over the last
Yeah.
6 months of like insanely good sentences, and it kills me because
So
like
Dwight Garner has been
so
on
Dwight Garner's
too,
in the feature a lot. He's another. Maureen Dowd gets nominated tons. So I also have to kind of put the ixnay on her occasionally, lest you, Ron Charles, Maureen Dowd, and Dwight Garner run away with the whole thing every damn week, you know. I'm trying to think of who else is like just kind of constantly being nominated. I think you four are the leaders.
So there are pundits who everyone loves.
Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post,
Yes,
she's nominated
she's
a lot
terrific. There are pundits who everyone loves, and then there are pundits who are really admired by other pundits. It's like not only being a great musician, but being a musician's musician, because people who are in the business know how hard it is to do it consistently well, to do it consistently brilliantly, week in and week out. And my pundit's pundit is you. Frank is
I already told him I'm buying dinner, so I do not understand this. You know.
My idea of what a really great soul and a great pen can do when they come together in the same person. It's an honor to share the stage with you. Get the book, and we'll see you again soon.
It's an honor to share the stage with you, and I thank you.